So I know that all the presenters work super hard on everything they put together and all their presentation materials. So let's let them take it away. This is trauma-informed prosecution.
Hi, I'm just gonna share my screen.
Oh, and I forgot to mention, there's a rubric that you can find, I believe, in the chat that you can just, it's totally optional, but you can provide your feedback as the presentation goes. Yeah, it'd be super helpful for the fellows, but obviously if it's gonna distract you from the presentation, don't worry about it.
Okay, so thank you everyone for attending our presentation on trauma-informed prosecution. First and foremost, we would like to introduce ourselves. My name is Ria Alawalia and I'm a junior at the Spence School. Over the past few months, me and the rest of this team has been granted the opportunity to sit alongside reform advocates that have enlightened and inspired us about change in the criminal justice system. I've been so humbled by this whole research process and learning about the nuances of trauma through the lens of justice, and I'm really proud of the work our team has done.
Hi, I'm Elliot Stephanopoulos. I'm also a current junior at the Spence School. Personally, I've always been interested in the criminal justice system, and through learning from Lucy Lang and Michelle Mason, I've gained a very valuable education on the subject. It's been so great and fun and enriching to work with my fellow group members, and it's been a nice challenge to figure out the best way we can help the IIP. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Gianna Borbola, and I go to School of the Future. I'm grateful to have received this opportunity to work alongside 3 very passionate students and present a project on such a crucial issue. And we've gathered a lot of valuable information from Michelle, the IIP, and Standa, and we're thrilled to be able to show that to you today.
Hi, I'm Anna Krantz, and I'm a junior at Baruch College Campus High School. And I came into this opportunity knowing that this was something I was really passionate about, but I also knew it was something that I could learn so much more about. And I definitely got that and was able to, and as a group, we were able to work with some amazing people and come up with a project that we're really proud of. And before we start, there's a few people we would like to thank, like the amazing Michelle Mason from the IIP, for providing us with resources and being a mentor throughout this entire process, as well as someone who has helped us understand what trauma-informed prosecution really is. So thank you, Michelle.
We would also like to thank Lucy Lang for allowing us to attend a roundtable discussion about trauma-informed prosecution at John Jay University alongside prosecutors, survivors, and psychologists.
And last but certainly not least, we'd like to thank Standa for inspiring fruitful dialogue in our Civic Action Project and beyond, and for being present every step of the way.
So for the duration of this presentation, we will be discussing research evidence about the effects of trauma, contextualizing the issue within our community, and charging responsibility to our prosecutors, survivors, and all who encounter trauma. Finally, our Civic Action Project as a small formative solution to a larger issue about addressing justice reform. So to ground our presentation, we want to dispel our main claim in that cultural norms for responding to trauma need to be recognized and broken down. When we attended the roundtable discussion about the neurobiological effects of trauma on the brain, our conclusion was that the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and hippocampus are all negatively affected by trauma, impairing memory, learning, and capacity to retain contextual information. The issue lies in the fact that for victims of violent crime who may suffer from psychological trauma as a result of their victimization, evolving themselves in the justice system may compound the original injury. However, what inspired us from biological research was neuroplasticity of the brain, which allows the neurons in the brain to compensate for injury and disease, something that was emphasized at the roundtable as a call for social emotional support, as well as trauma-educated reform.
Our goal is to work to help the IIP implement trauma-informed prosecution in courts in New York City so that there's an overall more understanding, compassionate, holistic system. What we want to see is for proper trauma courses to be implemented in the police academy and law schools so that court members can be aware of the signs of trauma, the lasting effects of trauma, and recognize their own secondhand trauma. Secondly, for social workers to be integrated into law enforcement and the court proceedings as victim support. Thirdly, for victims to have control over their story and opportunity to tell it properly without being re-traumatized or re-victimized. Fourthly, reframe steps and terminology in court proceedings for a more empathetic approach. and finally, an end to confession-based work. If these implementations are successful, victims will be properly supported mentally and emotionally, and the court systems will become a safer place than ever before. To understand what trauma is like in New York City, there were 95,593 reported crimes in 2019. Based on the data we gathered from the New York government, in murder cases, 56.6% of the victims are Black, 31.2% of the victims are Hispanic, 66.9% of the victims are Asian Pacific Islander, and 4.9% of the victims are white. In rape cases in New York, 34.8% of the victims are Black, 35.4% of the victims are Hispanic, 8% of the victims are Asian Pacific Islander, and 18.1% of the victims are white. And finally, in robbery cases, 29.5% of the victims are Black, 39.5% of the victims are Hispanic, 15.6% of the victims are Asian Pacific Islander, and 14.3% of the victims are white.
So in order to understand trauma-informed prosecution, we have to understand the role of the prosecutors. And so the roles and responsibilities of the prosecutors as defined by the American Bar Association dictates that the prosecutor is an administrator of justice, a zealous advocate, and an officer of the court. Their primary duty is to seek justice within the bounds of the law, not merely to convict. The prosecutor serves the public interest and should act with integrity and balanced judgment to increase public safety, both by pursuing appropriate criminal charges of appropriate severity and by exercising discretion to not pursue criminal charges in appropriate circumstances. And this last piece really encaptures the long-standing status quo of standard practice, which is that the prosecutor is not merely a case processor, but also a problem solver responsible for considering the broad goals of the criminal justice system. But with the responsibility to consider the broad goals of the criminal justice system, prosecutors can lose sight of the trauma elements within a case or use it to assess credibility rather than to give an authentic voice to those involved. So the first issue with this traditional approach is re-traumatization. Re-traumatization occurs when an individual is exposed to people, events, or places that allow trauma to resurface in a similar manner to the trauma they originally experienced. And this could happen either by understanding the position of extreme power a prosecutor is in, or by being asked to recount their story they've already given various times to other sources prior to actually meeting with their prosecutor. The next issue is confession-based work, which requires information to make a charge and can become a complicated task when understanding that trauma often rewires the brain and disturbs accurate memory. And this puts the individual in a vulnerable position to be re-traumatized. And in line with the last point are credibility assessments. The role of a prosecutor is to assess the credibility of those involved in a case. And if this is done in an accusatory or overbearing manner, a trauma survivor can feel great discomfort among other adverse feelings.
And I think you have to go back one slide, sorry.
Sorry. Oh, okay.
So the role of the jury is to listen to the evidence during a trial, decide what facts the evidence has established, and draw inferences from those facts to form the basis for their decision. The jury ultimately decides whether a defendant is guilty or not guilty in criminal cases and liable or not liable in civil cases. They are considered to be a randomly selected group of your peers in an effort to add sympathy and an outside perspective to a criminal or civil case.
So it's always going to be difficult to have a completely unbiased jury despite the measures that we take to do so. Despite wanting to have a neutral jury, trauma cases are not just one-sided, and having an uneducated jury can seriously harm the outcome of the case, especially if they don't know the signals of trauma. To fix this, we think it would be essential for jury members to be briefed with information on what trauma is and the signals of it. Oftentimes, clues of trauma are synonymous with clues of lying, which confuses the members of the jury and puts the victim to be at risk for a false sentence. If a lesson plan teaching members of the jury of basic signs of trauma, it would make the criminal court system a safer place for victims. So the process of going through with charges in a trauma case can be extremely uncomfortable and violating, not only for the survivor, but for their survivor's family as well. People don't want to have to go through this process, especially knowing that in many cases, the outcomes are not in their favor. So the most common reason as to why people do not report these crimes is that they feel as though they would rather suffer through it than compromise themselves, their family, social life, job, etc. And in most cases, victims don't report the crime or decide not to press charges once they have reported it. Although outdated, a study in the 1980s showed that the percentage of victims who reported the crime was only between 8 and 16%, which shows how low it is. So trauma, as some people don't know, is an umbrella that can be subdivided into many categories, which can also be put onto a spectrum. Treating all trauma cases in the same way can potentially be severely harmful to those involved, as well as create a norm that will not be effective. Additionally, if we're not providing support and tools for the survivors while making them go through the process of an investigation, the effects of the trauma can escalate and the process will in turn become more harmful than helpful.
Up to 90% of youth with justice involvement have experienced some traumatic event, with around 30% meeting diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. Given these high rates of trauma and frequency of co-occurring disorders that make trauma difficult to identify, offices should institute a presumption of trauma. This includes internal changes to reduce re-traumatization of youth and children who come into contact with the office. Additionally, trauma-informed practices can improve the quality of information collected from our citizens, increase their willingness to comply with requirements, and improve their perceptions of the justice system in whole. Our Civic Action Project was birthed from our inherently research-based project. Our action is to educate those around us about our research, voice the stories of people in New York, and provide a web presence for the resources to disperse real-time information about trauma in the criminal courts in the city. Our mission statement highlights what we hope to accomplish with the TIP project. The Trauma-Informed Prosecution Project is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that seeks to create a sense of national urgency about trauma in the criminal justice system. In its scale and brutality, the American justice system is a global aberration. With the US holding only 5% of the global population, we also hold 25% of the world's incarcerated. Through meaningful dialogue, education, and institutional cooperation, we at TIP believe that a conversation about reducing trauma in prosecution is possible. The TIP project works in partnership with the Institution for Innovation in Prosecution to study problems that impede human dignity and justice. We harness the power of evidence to drive effective practice and discussion about the change we want to see in our communities. As a student-led organization, we believe in the importance of research and education to expose the hard truths about the issues prosecutors, victims of abuse, and others face inside and outside the criminal courts. We are urging students, educators, and people in law enforcement to use this platform as a guide to teach, learn, and inspire change. Firmly based in New York City, we conduct interviews, support justice organizations, and provide news updates about our city's system of justice and how we encounter trauma.
And with our Spotlight, Tip News, and Get Engaged pages, the public can develop a deeper understanding for trauma, which is essential for potential jurors, and stay updated on new developments in trauma-informed prosecution.
Okay, are you guys finished?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so we are a little strapped for time, but now I'd like to open it up for questions. So feel free to use the chat room to type out your questions, and then your expert panelists can respond to them. And I think we'll probably have about like around 8 minutes for that, so that we can kind of reconvene at 3:45. And then we'll move on to feedback and then talking to the partners that you guys work with for a bit. So questions first, if anyone has. So you can use the chat, or I guess you could just speak onto your mic and talk straight out if that's easier for you.
Thank you. What a great presentation. I'm so grateful for your partnership, and it has been really fun seeing how this has all come together for you all. I think it's an incredibly important movement in the field of prosecution, and it couldn't be more timely at this moment when there are progressive prosecutors getting elected all over the country. So I guess a question I have is why does it matter sort of beyond the context of like sex crimes and domestic violence, gender-based violence, and well, does it matter to other kinds of crimes, and why?
So I can take that question. So a majority of the research that we took and a majority of the demographics that we found were affected by trauma really did surprise us in the fact that they're not only victims of trauma. The people who come to the justice organizations or they come to the offices, those are not the only people that encounter trauma. We had a lot of speakers at the roundtable discussion talk about how prosecutors were experiencing trauma after, dealing with really hard cases. So in general, being trauma informed doesn't only impact the victims of trauma, but all those who are involved, social workers, prosecutors, DAs. It's important for all parties who are involved in that system to be trauma informed, because so many of those biases and that post-traumatic stress disorder can really impact and hinder future investigation and future prosecution. So we not only find that it's important for victims and survivors of abuse, but also for those who are serving the community.
Awesome.
Sorry. To answer Ada's question, if we explored real life cases in which trauma affected a case or an outcome specifically, when we went to the roundtable, we were presented with a lot of information specifically on neurobiology. And from there, we were given case studies, and we wanted to put those in our projects, but because trauma is so unique to each person, it was hard to narrow down how we could simplify it. So we mainly just stuck to the information we were given from previous case studies, our roundtable.
Adding on a little to Elliot, we're hoping that on the spotlight page of our website that we're working on, we can interview survivors, and if they're comfortable, share their stories so that more people can access them and see the different types of trauma. So we're definitely trying to do that, and that's kind of one of our next steps that we're trying to achieve.
I see another question from Lucy Nuttall. Why do you think this topic is not widely explored or studied?
Yeah, so that was also a question that I think all of us on our team really had when we came to the roundtable discussion. Trauma is seen in so many of criminal justice cases. Why isn't it a discussion that's been happening? And I remember that prosecutors at the table were talking about how standard practice for prosecutors has been so rigid, like that it's hard to go back and, change that. And because there's such a stigma around, being hardcore and getting the job done, that it's really created this environment where, prosecutors are there to serve and they're there to, find a verdict. And it's having that standard practice has not only like negatively affected people's perception of the justice system, but also is not allowed for that conversation about how can we help ourselves, how can we help our community, how can we help our offices become more emotionally intelligent about the issues that we're dealing with. But I think that's also a question for people who work in offices, because I don't know that answer firsthand.
Hi, I was wondering if I could ask a question. Hi guys, I think you did a great job with the presentation, and I've seen a lot of the website, and I wanted to know what you guys thought was the most important part of having this information more focused about educating the public versus just the office. I think that when you came to the roundtable, obviously it's overwhelming with all these different ideas and facets of the justice system. But what do you think is, maybe I'll do a two-part question, what do you think is the most important thing for the general public to know about trauma? And also, if you could speak a little bit about why you chose to focus on educating the public, who, in turn does become the jury.
Well, with the jurors, all of us eventually will be called to do our civic duty as jury members. So I think just educating the public is ultimately educating future jurors. And I think just to go about life and be more empathetic and understanding of trauma, because everyone will experience some sort of trauma in some way, not necessarily specific to the types of cases we focused on in our presentation. But really our goal was, by educating the public, we're therefore educating the future who will be going into the court system.
And addressing the first part of your question about what do you think is most important for the public to know, I feel like it's important for the public to educate themselves that trauma isn't just one thing. I think I said this in the presentation, but it's an umbrella that falls into so many terms and it has a spectrum. And also for people to kind of know the signs of trauma and realize that there are so many subcategories, and to understand that it's not just, people can't just get trauma from murder or sexual assault. There's so many different subcategories, and I feel like a lot of the public doesn't know that. So I think, for me personally, I think that's something that's really important for them to educate themselves on.
Well, unless anyone has any super pressing questions, so does anyone, any last thoughts or questions that they want to add? Okay, so then maybe let's move into hearing from the partners a little bit more, Lucy Lang and Michelle Mason. I know you guys have already talked a little bit, but maybe touch a little bit on what you guys do and then what your experience was working with the presenters.
Great, thanks so much. I'll talk a little bit about our organization, and then I'm going to ask Michelle to talk about this project in particular because she's really the visionary who's leading it. I served as a prosecutor in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office for many years, where I prosecuted violent crimes, including homicides and domestic violence. And I came to John Jay about 2 years ago to work on big picture criminal justice reform issues through the lever of prosecutors' offices. And it's been really exciting to be working with DAs everywhere who are taking on some of the issues that have been raised by this group and others. I am very mindful of the lack of education around trauma because it was my experience as a prosecutor that I was working with people who had been incredibly victimized at the most vulnerable times in their life. And of course, I would try to be kind and thoughtful and sort of exercise basic human connection skills, but I really had no expertise in that area. I did get some measure of training when I started handling domestic violence cases, but again, it was very limited to sort of how to get what is needed in order to prove a criminal case. So when Michelle joined us at the IIP last year and expressed an interest in this concern, started raising, sharing a lot of literature with me about what other fields know about trauma, I realized how sort of siloed how this is an example of the silos of the criminal justice system really undermining the public's well-being overall. And so I was thrilled when Sanda and you all decided to join us on the beginning stages of this work in helping better educate prosecutors about what we're learning from neuroscientists, social workers, psychologists, and other folks who really have the expertise that lawyers just don't get. So Michelle, you want to talk a bit more about this work?
Yes. So like Lucy said, and that you guys brought up, that you guys came to our roundtable discussion. And I think that working at the IIP, that was such an amazing and rich discussion, as well as something that we all came out a little bit overwhelmed in the best way possible about all these different ways in which we can engage with that idea. And I know that when we first met right after that, the fellows were as overwhelmed in, you know, the best way. And I think that educating the public is such an important, you know, element that we don't always think about. I think that that speaks to this, you know, fellowship experience as a whole, right? That we, as citizens, we need to be civically engaged, and we all will participate on a jury, and we all will participate within the criminal justice system. And if maybe people had some sort of insight into how trauma affects them as an individual, as well as how that plays within the system, that people would really start to change their view of how things have been operating, right? So it was really a great process of kind of reaching that point where it's like, okay, what can we do right now? And the fellows came up with the idea of this website that, you know, could be available to everyone. It could be a real resource. And I believe you've also wanted to, you know, presentation and really focus on the youth and young people, and having teachers, or if you could maybe speak to more about what your idea of who you would like to be getting this information. But I think that as receptive as you were to all of this information is really what inspired you to then decide that you could make this resource available on a website. But also, I would love if you guys could speak about how you hope to see this training carry over in schools, in your own schools.
Well, if anyone has any feedback, now's the time, or last thoughts. If not, we can start to trickle back into the main room for the calls to action, commitments, and appreciation. So everything we're going to do to kind of close out the day. Yeah, Shannon said, coming back in a minute. So if anyone has any last minute things they want to say.
Great job, everyone. Really inspirational.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Look forward to following up and seeing how the website starts to turn out.